So my assignment is to talk about reptiles and amphibians. An acronym or an abbreviation for that is HERPS, which is short for herpetofauna, which means to crawl, creatures that crawl. And there are more kinds of amphibians and reptiles than we have in Indiana. And there's some weird ones like caecilians and amphibians. So you end up with some kind of herp that looks like this, and it kind of looks like a worm, but it's not. It's actually a reptile, kind of called an amphibianid. And actually, if you look, you can see scales. There's an eye, a mouth, a nostril. And so on close inspection, it doesn't really look like an earthworm. But we have salamanders, frogs, turtles, snakes, and lizards that we can talk about today. And what I like to do in these presentations is cover a variety of natural history items that I think might interest you and or clarify some things that you're wondering about, and do a little bit of a tour of the reptiles and amphibians that we have. If I tried to do all of them, there's 100-ish, and I don't think we want to do that. So I picked 99 that I'm going to talk about. It's a secret. That's actually, there's a quiz, which you're used to. I mean, don't you always get quizzed on stuff? So which reptile did I... Oh, I gave it away. It could be an amphibian. All right, so with amphibians, we're talking about a moist skin as in contrast to reptiles. No scales. It is interesting to note that fish have scales and reptiles have scales. And then in the middle are amphibians. And the scales of fish are, the hard part of the scale is actually dermal bone. And in a reptile or a bird or something like that, the hard part of the scale is epidermal, is keratinaceous. So actually the scales of reptiles and the scales of fish are not the same things. One of the things we always notice with amphibians, in most cases the larval stage is external, so we can see the polywogs or that kind of thing swimming around. That's not always true, but generally is. And they have unshelled eggs, which is to say they don't have a calcareous shell. They don't have calcium in like a chicken egg. None of them do, as far as I know. They lay eggs typically in wetland situations, and that's something that I would like to highlight. But at the right time of year, typically in the spring, for most species, you can go out and you can find them. So here's like toad eggs. Here's some sort of mole salamander eggs with the larvae developing. Those in the front can actually see them. And so as one of my side messages or added messages that I want to bring forward is it's really important to conserve wetlands if you want to conserve reptiles and amphibians. And if you make a list of all the reptiles and amphibians that are in trouble in Indiana, almost all of them have to have wetlands. So I want to talk about that for a little bit. And some of the messages there are, it turns out that shallow wetlands are extremely important. And they don't have fish in them, so people might think, well, what good are they? It turns out that they're really good for amphibians and reptiles. And fish are a problem. Fish eat eggs and larvae, and you cannot have a lot of species of amphibian and reptile if you also have fish. So have fish somewhere, but not everywhere. And then, of course, there's issues with pesticides and fertilizers and that kind of thing. And then another point that I'll make today is we want to think about connectivity between habitat fragments, not just a wetland in isolation. And then the other thing, because a lot of folks in this room are going to be naturalists or something along that line, or just naturally curious in a similar fashion, the advice I have for those folks is to limit the collection of native organisms from the wild and bringing them in. This facility actually could be a bit of an exception to that if some rules are followed, and that is generally to catch is to keep. What we don't want is people catching things, bringing them in, keeping them for a while, letting them go, especially somewhere else, and then moving stuff around, because then disease goes along with those organisms, and then we're making things worse. And the other message is don't mix things from various places. If you want to have something on display, like LC could have a display, and they could just take critters from here. And then when they let them go, they just put them right back where they found them. And that way there's no mixing. They're just cycling them on site, and that's a lot better. So that brings up this last message, that anything that's brought to a facility needs to go back where it was found. And part of that has to do with disease, but part of it also has to do with the fact that organisms like reptiles and amphibians know where they are. And I've done 30 years of research to show that over and over again. And if you pick them up and you take them somewhere else, they're lost. And then they try to figure out where the heck they are, and they make gigantic movements, and they cross roads and get in farms, and they get killed. So it's best to put them back where they were. Okay, so here's my biggest theme for conservation today, and that's the importance of ephemeral wetlands. And ephemeral means temporary. You might be more familiar with seasonal wetlands. If you're aware of some of the problems with policy in the state of Indiana, which is actually going to be a topic at the conversation, isolated wetlands are often temporary and therefore viewed as not really wetlands. But if you understand the biology of them, you see that it's the fact that they are ephemeral which is what makes them so special. And that lack of understanding there is part of our bigger problem. So, and then you might hear them called vernal wetlands. Vernal is spring, and so if they fill late winter, early spring, that's a vernal wetland. If they fill in the fall, that's an autumnal wetland. So there's different terms for you. And I like to illustrate why we should be concerned about these kinds of things by just following one species, which is, for us, the wood frog, Rana sylvatica. The placard that the woman is holding says December 30th. And what you should notice is she's standing in the middle of our wetland and there's no water. And what we want to do is watch how that changes over the year. And I use this log with this saw cut as one landmark, and this tree that's fallen over shaped kind of like a V as another. And here's March 26th, and you can still see the log, and you can still see the tree. And what you might also note is that the top of the wetland is covered with a skin of ice, and that this guy had to walk and break that ice to walk out there. It's not very thick, but it's still pretty cold, and I can't stand over there because I can't see the screen. So, and that might be important. What's interesting about this is that by this time, a lot of species have come and maybe even left. They're done already. And it's when they leave, and then we're seeing something like this. And like, okay, now people can say, okay, this is a wetland. It has some emergent vegetation, but by the way, there's my log floating around. The placard says June 28th, and there's our tree. And now a leaf out is well along, and so now you can't see the road in the background or anything like that. So if somebody walked up to this now, they'd say, oh, okay, that's fine. Looks like a wetland. And there's lots going on at that time, all sorts of invertebrates, all sorts of amphibians and reptiles and migratory birds, all kinds of cool stuff is happening. The tadpoles develop very rapidly. They are herbivorous, they feed on algae, and then they metamorphose and they transition. And everybody in here knows about the resorption of a tail, the sprouting of the legs, that kind of thing. Here's something that I didn't think about until a couple of years ago when I was asked on Valentine's Day to give a talk about amphibian and reptile hearts. It was like a cutesy sort of, hey, it's Valentine's Day, we like reptiles and amphibians. So that's when I realized that one thing that it's true is here it's an herbivore, it's becoming an insectivore, and here it's not able to do either one, so it has to go through a period of not eating. But think about the inside of the animal too. It had gills, and it's switching over to lungs, and if you think about it, the cardiovascular system, all the pipes and everything all have to be modified. So the point is that the metamorphosis is happening throughout the organism. And then we get to fall. And here we are with no water again. So somebody might say, well, too bad about your amphibians. And I would say, well, they're all fine, they've already left. And that's exactly what has happened, that these animals are adapted for these short-lived systems. And if they have 2 or 3 or 4 months, depending on the species, they're done. And the wetland has served its purpose. And our little frogs, or our little mini adult frogs, are off hopping around doing their thing. And then here we are back, and the cycle starts again. The one thing that I like to highlight here that's just an interesting biological fact is there are a limited number of species that can freeze in the winter. They don't overwinter in the water, they actually overwinter underneath debris on the forest floor. And so you could take this frozen frog and put it up here on the table, and while we were sitting here, it would start to thaw out, and the heart would start to beat, and start to breathe, and off it would go. And it turns out that the temperatures of soil where the water table is close to the surface actually only get to about freezing. They don't get super cold, because if they did, the animals would die. But if they just get a little bit below freezing, they're fine. Another message is that not all wetlands are the same. In fact, every single one is different from all the others, but there's a variety of types based on their hydrology, how quickly they dry out. Are they flashy? Do they fill up and then drain down, or do they last for years and then dry out, that kind of thing? And using species that I've studied, we can look at that. So that would include things like the copper-bellied water snake, eastern Massasauga, the only venomous snake in northern Indiana, Blanding's turtle, spotted turtle. If we take all those and we just put them on a continuum of 0 water depth to infinity, what we notice is that even for aquatic organisms, on average, if we do radio telemetry on them and follow them all year long, they don't go in very deep water. The deepest they spend a lot of time for an adult Blanding's turtle would be knee depth. And that means that the little baby Blanding's turtles, these guys are a few years old, and you can see the transmitters we have on them to track them. And over here we have teenagers, and the transmitters we had on there to track them. They're in water that's this deep. And the Kirtland snake lives right on the boundary. And the Butler's garter snake, right on the boundary. Massasaugas, right on the boundary. Spotted turtles, only in averaging water this deep. And copperbellies are a little more flexible, but still, the big driver here is that when you look at a pond and you ask what good is it for reptiles and amphibians, the answer is not very much except on the shore. And that actually the wetlands with their shallow water structure are the most valuable. So we need to protect isolated wetlands and ephemeral wetlands and shallow wetlands. And then just to mention connectivity, it turns out that a lot of the species that I've done research on, they don't stay in one wetland. They might travel a mile and go back and forth between different wetlands. And if they can't do that safely, then they're in trouble. So the more roads we have, the more disconnections we have between habitat, the harder it is for these species to persist in the landscape. A big one, I have founded a lot of my career studying habitat requirements and habitat loss, habitat reconstruction, that kind of thing. But it turns out that there's other threats that are ever growing, and one of them is disease. And just, there's a variety, but one that you may have heard of is chytrid. The actual organism that causes it is sometimes called B-cell, because the Trachochytrium salmonidiviriums is hard to say. But there's also ranavirus, there's a variety of other diseases that are coming online. And for this one, just as my example, this is really causing havoc on species around the world, but it was apparently brought to us and to Europe by a fire salamander, sort of this beautiful salamander from Asia, which is resistant to the disease, but we bring them over, and then they start mixing with native species in somebody's aquarium or that kind of thing, or they let them go, or they get away, and now we have all kinds of declines. The species that was highlighted here is the fire salamander. The red, now that I've noticed that, it's a striking salamander that people want for pets, but it has disease. And we find over and over again that moving these things around can lead to losses of almost 100%. So it's not good. All right, I'll insert some other factoids and stuff, but I want to start my tour. And I'll start with salamanders and work my way through. And I've been tempted to start this with frogs in the years that I've done this, but I realized the more primitive, the tetrapod, the four-legged thing, would be the salamander instead of the frogs. So we'll do frogs later. But notice the elongate body, the little tiny limbs, a big robust tail, and also coastal grooves or costal grooves. And for those of you in front, I think you can see those. They're folds that make the body kind of like an accordion. And usually, you biologists will know that for most taxonomic groups, biodiversity gets larger and larger the closer you get to the equator. That is not true for salamanders. And And blue down here is 1, and red, this is what you would call a heat map. So the hot areas are up equal to or greater than 30. The cool areas are around 1. Most of the areas are blue, which tells us they have 1 or 2 or 3 species. Indiana does pretty well, especially down south, but the Appalachian Mountains have by far the greatest salamander diversity in the world. So that's kind of cool. And some things about salamanders is they have a variety of really interesting reproductive courtship behaviors and that kind of thing. And there's all kinds of dances that they do. They also may take on the males may take on a striking morphology that's different from the females during the breeding season, and do things like stroke her face and that kind of thing. I've tried that. Sometimes it works. And then when she likes the guy, he puts down a spermatophore, and the female comes by and picks that up with her cloaca, and then the sperm swim up into her, so they have internal fertilization.
They have a cigarette afterwards?
Yeah. So the chicken and the egg were in bed, and the egg is smoking a cigarette, and the chicken says, well, that answers that question. He started. Okay, so Ambystomata salamanders are an important taxon in Indiana. They are fairly large for a salamander, so a real big one would fit in the palm of your hand, and maybe the tail would sort of hang off to the side. They're called mole salamanders because they spend most of their life underground. We were digging artificial hibernacula for copperbelly water snakes, and for a release experiment we were going to do, and about 6 feet underground, there's one in the wall of the burrow. When they didn't fortunately they didn't hurt it, but there it was, 6 feet underground. So they're down there cruising around. And that's pretty cool. They breed late winter, early spring. Before it's very when you have those spring rains and things start to have a hint of warming, and if there's fish in the wetlands, they won't succeed. And most are in the forest, but some are in grasslands. So tiger salamanders is an example of a grassland species. Blue-spotted salamander, relatively uncommon forest species, and then smallmouth salamanders are the most abundant, I believe, anywhere around here. And here's spotted salamanders. You can find them in some places. And here's a bigger picture of a smallmouth. Now, an interesting thing about them that sometimes occurs is paedomorphosis. And paedomorphosis is being sexually mature but retaining juvenile characteristics. So, and tiger salamanders commonly do this. You'll have eggs, you can start there. Everybody's going to have to start with larvae. But in the paedomorphs, the larvae just get bigger and become sexually mature. And then otherwise, they become terrestrial adults and move out and then come back to breed. And the paedomorphs just stay in the wetland. So they have to be in wetlands that don't ever dry out. So that's kind of cool. Another bizarre thing, family in the world, and most of them are in North America. They're lungless because they don't have lungs. They do all the respiration through their skin, and so they can't get very big because the ratio between the tissue volume and the surface area gets worse and worse as you get bigger and bigger. And just like with insects, they can never get very big. except in movies. Another feature is this nasolabial groove right here, which apparently transfers some molecules from the nostril down into the mouth, or vice versa. And there's some variety up here. The big one is a redback. I'll touch on that later. Northern slimy, longtail. But there's a salamander. We have the leadback version and the redback version. And the natural history thing I would say here is that I would think it would surprise you that there is, in some areas, there's more biomass of salamander than all other vertebrates combined. So you go out to a mountain in the Appalachians, and if you sampled everything, deer, muskrat, everything, there's more salamander than everything else. So they're really abundant, but they're just hard, you don't see them because they're hiding. And this is a two-line salamander. We also have these around here, like at Kokawani, if you ever go to Kokawani. And then quickly, other salamanders, the eastern newt. What's fun about eastern newts is they have an intermediate step of subadults, which is called the red eft. And this is the terrestrial phase for newts, brightly colored individuals, and they get up to a certain size, and then they go back and stay for the rest of their lives back in the water. But they start out for a while out on land. But they can vocalize, and the way this works is they bring air in, but they don't send it to the lungs. They send it to the vocal sac on the neck, and then they compress that. And depending on the size of the frog, the size of its head, and the structure of those apertures, you get different kinds of calls. But you can go to a wetland, and you have to go several times so that you find everybody, but you can listen and you can tell who's there, because their calls are different. In the frogs, the big guys are the Ranidae. Here's a hefty bullfrog. They actually don't use ephemeral wetlands because the tadpoles will overwinter at least one time, if not twice. And so when you see their tadpoles, it took them a while to grow that big. So they're in at least semi-permanent wetlands. And they're a problem because since you can eat frog legs, people have moved them around. And a lot of places, then the bullfrogs eat everything else that's there. So here you have if an area like, say out in Arizona, gets bullfrogs, then the bullfrogs are invasive and they eat all the native species. So that's a problem. In Arizona, they have an active program to get rid of bullfrogs everywhere. There's a bullfrog. We can compare that to a green frog. The difference is this dorsolateral fold right here. Notice that's on the green frog. It isn't on the bullfrog. And so if you look at, and the colors are the same, they're kind of green, kind of brown, some mix. That's not going to help you. What's going to help you is it big, and does it or does it not have a dorsolateral fold? There's a tadpole, bullfrog tadpole. They're big. And you can get in a wetland, like I've been doing tadpole surveys in one wetland, and the whole thing can be just seething with these guys. Wood frogs, I mentioned them before, they're also in the same family, Ranidae, except they need ephemeral wetlands. Leopard frogs, also ranids, but they need ephemeral wetlands. And then this one, which sure looks like this one, but isn't. There's a couple of differences. One is, do you notice how these markings are rectangular, and these are ovals. And also, this one has this yellow suffusion down here. That's warning coloration. When this frog, it's like a flash of color when the frog jumps, and it can startle predators and keep them from hitting things. These also are a little bit poisonous, and they live in seeps as opposed to wetlands.
What's the name of that one?
That one's a pickerel frog. Now, they're around, but people think they see leopard frogs. They assume that they're leopard frogs, and they miss the fact that they saw a pickerel frog. Then there's the tree frogs, the hylidae. Some of these are arboreal, but not all of them. Most of them are pretty small, and I can't think of any around here that get bigger than about that.